Hello, everyone. Thank you. Look at all of you on the edge of your cliff. Yeah. You have a lovely city, by the way. This is really impressive place. I was here before, and well, now I remember, I thought it was impressive then, but you know, it's a bit like Toronto, except it's just got a bit of a, I don't know, it's just a little glossier edge, I would say. Of course, we have winter in Canada, and so everything looks kind of bedraggled after being encased in ice for like 5 months. So, but it's got a bit of a flavor of New York. It's really something. What do you say? Good on ya? Is that the, yeah, is that the right saying? So I thought I would talk to you tonight about some of the rules in my book, and I was sitting backstage trying to figure out which one. I thought I would start with the first one. It's a very original place to start. I always try to find a different angle to approach these rules, say. And this is something you might want to know if you ever speak publicly, or privately for that matter. It's good to have a question in mind, you know. That's something you're investigating. That's what I do when I'm lecturing. They're not really lectures, they're investigations. I'm trying to address a problem that I believe to be a serious problem. And I have some ideas about how what the problem is, because formulating the problem precisely is very important. But I also have some ideas about what some answers might be, but I try not to cling too hard to those answers, because if it's really an important problem, you want the right answer, and the probability that you right now have the right answer is pretty low. And so if you have the opportunity to sharpen your answer and to flesh it out more, to make it more precise, then you should take that opportunity. And so I've never liked to deliver anything pre-packaged when I was lecturing as a university professor. You know, when you first start out, you're more likely to stick to your notes because you don't really know anything, and so you have to read things that you don't really know. But hopefully, as you build up your reservoir of genuine knowledge, you can increasingly dispense with the pre-preparation, and then you can just explore and think. And one of the reasons I like doing this is because it both gives me the opportunity and forces me to think about something that I regard as important, that grips me for at least the time I'm on stage. And also, I can see if, while I'm working through the problem, I'm doing it in a manner that is engaging and meaningful and compelling. And I can tell that because if I'm doing that properly, which means I'm threading the needle properly in some real sense, then people are paying attention. And that's a really solid signal, right? We say pay attention for a reason. Attention is effortful, and there's many things all of you could be paying attention to right now, all the various complications of your life. Many, many things could be clamoring internally and externally, for that matter, for your valuable attention. And so if I manage to thread the needle properly or walk the pathway properly, and it grips you in spite of those competitors, then that's a true signal that something of import is occurring. It's in some sense, it's almost like the definition of import. People pay attention to what they implicitly regard as important. And so I get to think about something important, something that grips me, to try to solve a problem. I get to see if I can go deeper into the problem and the solution that I've gone before, and then I get to test in real time whether or not the journey is worth the effort. And so that's a pretty good deal. And people seem to like that, and I've tried to think through why all of you have bothered to come here. I know it took time and energy to manage that, and there's many other things you could do. And so why are you here? And part of the reason is to walk through the process that I just described along with me. And it's an exciting thing to do. You know, it's definitely the case that before I come on stage, I do not know what's going to happen. I sit backstage and I think through what problem I want to address, but I have no idea really how I'm going to do it, though I sketch out some possibilities. And I certainly never know whether I'm going to be able to bring it to a compelling conclusion. It's like, in some sense, it's like coming out on stage to tell a joke, but not knowing what the punchline is going to be, and hoping desperately that you can tell the joke well enough so that the punchline will make itself manifest, but maybe not. And some lectures go better than others. Some cohere and come to the point more effectively than others. But generally it works. And it's, I think, part of what makes the spectacle, such as it is, gripping for the audience is that there's a high wire element to that, because I think it's evident, for reasons that are very difficult to understand, that we're going somewhere together and none of us know exactly how it's going to lay itself out. And so there's a kind of optimal uncertainty about that, right? And it's not predictable or sterile, and that makes it exciting. It makes the possibility of failure quite high. That's often why people, when they speak publicly, will read, right, or stick to their notes. Because if you do that, you won't be an utter catastrophic failure. Because at least you'll get through what you read, but you certainly won't succeed, not in any real sense. That's not a pathway to success. You have to take the risk. You have to take the risk in your life. And you can rely on what you've prefigured, or you can try to say what you think. It's very useful to say what you think, because then you know what you think. It's very useful to think, because if you think, then maybe you'll prevent yourself from doing direly stupid things. It's the point of thinking. So rule 1, do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. Now, I didn't say don't criticize them. I said do not carelessly denigrate them, right? Those are different ideas, and because it's perfectly reasonable to subject social institutions to criticism. Why? Well, people think of criticism as like an attack, but that's not really what criticism means. What criticism means is to separate the wheat from the chaff, but not because you want to get rid of the chaff exactly. It's because you want the wheat, right? And so if you introduce students to great literature, let's say in a philosophy class, perhaps you introduce your students to the writings of someone like Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche was unbelievably brilliant, and also contentious and argumentative and dangerous and provocative and prophetic and imaginative, a very complex person. And much of what he says has unbelievable value. But you have to be discerning when you read it. And Freud is another good example of a thinker like that. Freud has been treated with contempt, especially in recent years. People who are psychologically minded think that we can dispense with Freud. Part of the reason they think that is because almost everything that Freud touched upon that was true genius, we all now think. So, for example, everyone believes there's an unconscious mind. It's like, well, that's obvious. It's like, yeah, it wasn't obvious before Freud. And so what's happened, although there were other thinkers who made forays in that direction, Freud was definitely the singular thinker who brought all that speculation together and then presented it in a way that was both systematic and comprehensible. And so now we just think of it as a matter of course that there's an unconscious. It's like, yeah, well, that was because of Freud. And so what we've done is incorporate everything he said that was correct into our implicit presumptions. It's just how we look at the world. And then there's some detritus left over, which is, say, Freud's second-rate thoughts, and we think, well, we can dispense with that, and we confuse Freud with the chaff. And that's very unfortunate. Freud's interpretation of dreams, there's never been a better book written about dreams than Freud's interpretation of dreams. It's unbelievably brilliant, and it's worth reading, not just because you can extract the gist out of it, and the gist is something like dreams have intrinsic meaning, which is also something that wasn't self-evident before Freud, but that the devil's in the details. There's much about what Freud says in relationship to dreams that's unbelievably useful practically to know. And so carelessly denigrate means to find something that you can criticize and then to throw, to use a cliche, the baby out with the bathwater. And the problem with that is, well, maybe you need to get rid of the bathwater, but you probably need to keep the baby. And the whole point of criticism, in self-criticism as well, isn't to destroy, please stop criticizing me. It's like, no, criticize me. Help me get rid of what isn't appropriate so that I can focus on what's appropriate. But that's the point, is to focus on what's appropriate, is to gather what you can gather, and to be a discriminating reader. We're all against discrimination now in some fundamental sense. To be a discriminating reader is to carefully move what's not of the highest value to one side and to retain what is truly of the highest value. And maybe you're the kind of careless denigrator who thinks, well, nothing's of true value. It's like, okay, fair enough, you can make that case, but it's going to be a very problematic case. You're going to be in trouble if you make that case, because you can be dubious about things of value. And you can be intellectually arrogant in that careless denigration and presume that your demolition of those things of value is a reflection of your intellectual prowess and integrity, but it leaves you vulnerable. And you might say, well, to what? Well, here's what it leaves you vulnerable to. Brilliantly intellectual and cynical though you may be, the probability that you're going to suffer intensely at some point in your life is 100%. And so you can be cynical about all you want, and you can throw the baby out with the bathwater, but one thing you can bloody well be sure is coming your way is pain. That's coming. Pain, uncertainty, frustration, disappointment, like existential catastrophe. In one form or another, man, that is definitely going to visit you. And you all know that because it's already visited all of you to some degree. And you're all here, and so you escaped sufficiently unscathed to remain standing, and so isn't that wonderful? But, you know, it's not over yet. And then you might ask yourself, well, given that that's the case, an existential reality, what do you have to buttress yourself against the catastrophe of that suffering? And the answer to that is, whatever it is of value that you've been able to glean. And if there's nothing of value, if you've subjected everything to a criticism so corrosive that you've left yourself with nothing, then that's what you will have when you need something. And I would not recommend that, because it's bad enough to suffer when you have something meaningful to abide by, but it's truly hell to suffer when you don't. And so, careless denigration, let's say, of social institution, you undertake that at your peril. Well, why creative achievement? Well, you could you could contrast social institution and creative achievement in some real sense. When you achieve something creatively, you reconfigure something that was once institutional, right? And the more profound your creative act, the more radically you've deconstructed and reconstructed some social institution. And that's a tricky business because you shouldn't carelessly denigrate social institutions for the reasons I just described, but by the same token, almost everything requires renewal, and there's genuine meaning to be found in renewal as well. And so part of the problem, eternal problem that we all face collectively and individually is, how do you balance the process of creative renewal with the process of the maintenance of structure? And that really is, it's an eternal battle. It's so fundamental, this problem, that it's really reflected in the structure, in the gross, large-scale structure of your brain. So you have a right hemisphere, and it's more concerned with responding to what's new and generating imaginative representations, and you have a left hemisphere, and it's more concerned with imposing a stable structure. And so the necessity for the imposition of a stable structure and yet the requirement for update is so utterly fundamental that your brain itself is bifurcated as a consequence of that necessity. And it's not just human brains, that seems to be how brains work. And it's such a deep necessity that systems that mimic cognition, so AI systems, also have to have the same property. They have to be able to maintain a certain degree of conceptual stability, but they have to be able to learn, which means they have to be able to update. And either of those can get out of hand. You have to get the balance right. So that's a relatively deep dive into the structure of this rule. Do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. From both of those enterprises, you can derive sustaining meaning. You can derive sustaining meaning as a consequence of the fact that you're securely embedded in social institutions. You can derive sustaining meaning from engagement in a creative enterprise. And then you could bring the two of those together, and you could posit that the deepest and most reliable sustaining meaning is the meaning that emerges from the proper balance of those other meanings. So if you're in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing, whatever that means, then you have one foot in the world of security, and so you're stable and not too pulled apart by complexity and its attendant anxiety, but you have another foot out into the domain that you do not understand, right? The domain of possibility, and there's an adventure in that, and if you balance that exactly right, then you're gripped, and that's the best thing that's the best place you can be. And that's a good thing to know too, because one of the things that we're doubtful about in the West, for a variety of reasons, is whether or not life itself, existence itself, being itself, you might say, becoming even, has any intrinsic meaning. And I think part of the reason that problem plagues us is actually because we formulate the problem incorrectly. We might say, well, what's the meaning of life? And there's a problem with that question, because the way the question's formulated presumes, in some sense, that there's a what would you call it? There's a bounded, explicit answer to that question that's something like a description of what life's meaning is, like a table, like a list of rules, let's say. And I don't think that that's the case. I think that meaning is the meaning of life is an existential reality. It's not something that can be just contained within an explicit description. And if you attempt to force the answer to that question, what is the meaning of life, into the confines of an explicit description, you don't get the right answer. One of the things I used to do with my clinical clients who were depressed, and you could say if you're depressed, you suffer from a surfeit of negative meaning, right? Because there's the negative meaning of life is suffering, and if you're depressed, you're overwhelmed by the negative meanings of life, and it's also the case, if you're depressed, that you're deprived of the positive meanings of life. You can think about that even biologically. As a biological condition, depression is characterized by excess negative emotion and by a decrement of positive emotion. Those are different biological systems, by the way. They're not simple opposites. They're independent biological systems. And so one of the things I would do with depressed people is like, well, you're depressed, so, okay? You're suffering too much. It's not sustainable. You're doubting the value of your own existence. Is there any variation in that? That was one of the first questions. So I might say to you, look, if you're depressed, first of all, one thing you want to understand if you're depressed is that when you're depressed, you think you're more depressed than you are. And what do I mean by that? Is that, well, depression has this weird cognitive catastrophe associated with it. And the catastrophe is that when you fall into the depression, it globalizes your negative viewpoint. So if you talk to someone who's depressed, they'll say, well, all of my past is terrible, the entire present is dreadful, and the future is going to be worse. It's this blanket presumption that covers everything, which is an indication, by the way, that in depression something very deep has gone wrong. Because it has to be deep and fundamental if it can affect everything, and it can. And so one of the things you do with depressed people is you say, or you can do, is you can say, look, I'm going to get you to track your mood just on a scale from 0 to 10 every 2 hours for the next 2 weeks. And just maybe you never get above maybe if you have, if your mood is at 1 out of 10, you're suicidal. And if it's at 5 out of 10, you can barely stand being alive, and if it's 10 out of 10, you're so joyful, you're damn near manic. That's something like the scale. And you might say, well, I never get above a 4 because I'm depressed. So that's fine. But you're not always at a 1. Or let's find out if you're always at a 1. Because sometimes the person will say that they are. It's like, so you get them to track their mood, and you come back and you find that there's actually more variability than the person presumed. So you'll find, for example, that they're much more, this is typical in depression, they're much more likely to be at a 1 out of 10 in the morning. And then as the day progresses, their mood tends to elevate. And so that's a useful thing to determine. Hunger can exacerbate feelings of depression. Here's a funny study. Imagine that you were going for a parole hearing, and you had to stand in front of the judge, and he had to decide whether to free you. You know, one of the biggest determinants of whether or not a judge will free a prisoner is whether he decides just before lunch or just after lunch. You have a way greater chance of being freed on parole if the judge isn't hungry. Yeah, and that's good to know, because you'll know this too if you've married or if you know any people, is that people are way harder to get along with when they're hungry. It's like, so if you want to have a serious conversation with your wife or your husband, like, feed them something first. Here, dear, have a peanut butter sandwich. We've got something to talk about. It's a very simple thing, and it's the same with you. It's like, don't have a serious conversation if you're hungry. That's stupid. You'll consign yourself to perdition, just like the hangry judge. So, all right. So, let's think about social institutions again. I wanted to talk to you a little bit. I was thinking about social institutions and what a social institution means. We just talked about the fact that you could find an optimized meaning in the interplay between the stability that institutions provide you and the creative exploration that you might undertake. I would say, in reference to another rule, this is worth thinking about, abandon ideology. That's rule number 6. I've been writing again, I'm writing a new book, I've been writing again about ideology. My students asked me many times what differentiated my viewpoint from an ideology. And underneath that was a notion that all systems of thought are ideologies. And that's, I would say, part of the postmodern critique. It's a viewpoint that lends itself quite nicely to a Marxist materialism, but it's also a very deep question. It's like, well, how do you distinguish between a valid system of belief, or is there such a thing, and just another ideology, or all systems of belief ideology? And so here's something to contemplate, and I do believe it's true, is that an epistemology, a structure of belief, that presents the dynamic balance between the maintenance of social order and the creative elaboration of that order, that presents that as the deepest source of meaning, that's not an ideology. And so that's worth thinking about. Now, and I was making a foray into the notion of meaning as something embodied. When you talk to people who are depressed and you get them to track their mood, they find that their mood varies, and you might find, for example, that they're actually happier when they're around people. And that's very common. Depressed people tend to isolate themselves. They often don't feel that they have anything to offer. They feel that their presence is a burden. They feel that they don't have the energy to engage in social interaction. They certainly feel that other people don't want to be around them. But if they actually go have some social interactions, it generally elevates their mood. And so, and maybe I had a client who was very, very depressed. He had a nihilistic and corrosive intellect that was very, very hard on him. But if he was engaging in his creative endeavors, he was a very creative person, he was actually doing pretty good. The trick with him was to get him to shut off his corrosive intellect and to immerse himself in his creative activity. And, you know, the intellect would come back and say, well, why do you think this creative activity is useful? It's, you know, what difference is it going to make in 10,000 years? And this is all foolish. And you know, you can give some credence to that voice, but his experience was that if he gave credence to that voice and stopped doing what was creative, then the world fell in on him catastrophically. And you could juxtapose that with the evidence that if he just engaged in his creative achievement and didn't allow that corrosive nihilism to undermine him, that he actually felt like being alive was okay. And we were working under the presumption that it would be better if he felt that being alive was okay, sort of a working definition of better. And so one of the propositions was, well, can we figure out what you do that provides you with a sustaining meaning, and have you practice doing more of that? And see, that's not really a propositional approach in some sense, right? It isn't based on the assumption that the meaning of life is something that you can describe. It's more based on the assumption that you can watch the quality of your own experience. You can see when you're engaged in an activity that lifts the existential dread from your shoulders. You can see that as an existential fact. It's actually something that's happening to you, not something you merely think or merely could say explicitly. And then you could think, well, I would rather be there than to be in any alternative place. And then you can practice that. And that's a good thing to know. And you can practice that. You can get very good at that. And that's part of that process of separating the wheat from the chaff. You know, you have to stand back from your life and you have to watch, like, well, when am I moving towards hell and when am I moving towards heaven, so to speak? And that's an empirical investigation in some real sense. And the specifics of the answer to that question differ from person to person. Some people, for example, if they're more introverted, will find more sustaining meaning in immediate relationships that are local, only one other person, or maybe even being alone, where someone extroverted will find the source of meaning in larger social groupings. There's temperamental variability, and so the answer isn't exactly the same from person to person. The details differ, but the meta-reality is the same, that there are activities that you can engage in that are more or less meaningful. So that's a commonality. And then another commonality is something like, if you strike the balance between the maintenance of order and the expansion and transformation of order properly, whatever property means for you, then that will put you in a place of maximal meaning. In fact, I believe, and I think the scientific evidence on this is not only clear, but incontrovertibly clear now. It wasn't that way 30 years ago when I started working through these ideas, but we've made a lot of progress. I think that you can make a real case that the instinct for meaning, so you can be gripped by something meaningful, you're gripped by an instinct. You might say, well, what's the core significance of the instinct for meaning? It's the meaning of meaning, let's say. And the meaning is that you're inhabiting the place of optimal learning and transformation. More than that, you're inhabiting the place of optimal stability combined with optimal learning and transformation. That's what the experience of meaning signifies. And it's real. In fact, I think it's more real than anything else. And that's a cool thing, because in our society, we tend to think that if you're not naive, the fact that life is meaningless, partly because we think objectively, is obvious, and you're just deluding yourself if you think otherwise. Like I said, what difference is it going to make in 100,000 years? And we're just, atomized individuals on a no-account planet circling a third-rate star at the corner of some galaxy among trillions of galaxies in this infinite expanse of time and space. What the hell difference does it make anyways? It's like, you could say, well, that's reality. It's like, no, that's a very dreadful take on reality. And the mere fact that you can conjure up a frame of representation that makes your proximal endeavors meaningless in contrast doesn't mean that they are intrinsically meaningless. It just means that you brought the wrong frame of reference to bear on the problem. If you're sitting in, let's say you go to a concert, and concert's a very good example of this, because music models the dynamic balance between chaos and order. Like, that's what it does, and it grips people with meaning. So you go to a concert, and you're in the groove, right? Which is, you're patterning yourself on this pattern of transformation that the musicians are offering to you. That's what you're doing, and it's a form of worship. And someone taps you on the shoulder and say, in 4 billion years, the sun is going to expand into a red giant and envelop the earth. It's like, why are you bothering with this? And the right answer to that is, why don't you go the hell away? Right? And that is the right answer, and that's a good thing to know about that kind of doubt when it emerges in your own life. It's like if you have a cognitive frame